The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace, but inside the grand walls, darkness seemed to have settled permanently. William stood at the tall window of his private study, his hands clasped tightly behind his back as he watched the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes his grandmother had loved so dearly. Each bloom reminded him of conversations they would never have again, of wisdom that would no longer guide him through the storms of royal duty. Kate entered quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. She had learned to move like a whisper through these halls lately, afraid that any sudden sound might shatter the fragile composure they both struggled to maintain. In her hands, she carried 2 cups of tea that had grown cold during her journey from the kitchen to his study. Neither of them had much appetite for anything these days, but the ritual of caring for each other had become their anchor in this sea of grief. "The children are asking about the garden party again," Kate said softly, setting the cups on the mahogany desk that had belonged to William's great-grandfather. "Charlotte keeps wondering why we canceled it, and George thinks it's because he did something wrong." William turned from the window, and Kate's heart broke a little more at the sight of his red-rimmed eyes. Sleep had become a stranger to both of them since the devastating news arrived 3 weeks ago. The official announcement had been brief and formal, but the private reality was a tsunami of loss that threatened to drown them both. The Queen, William's beloved grandmother, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at Balmoral, leaving behind a legacy that felt impossible to fill and a grandson who suddenly felt the full weight of his destiny pressing down on his shoulders. "How do I explain to them that everything has changed?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I tell our children that the woman who taught me what it means to serve, to sacrifice, to love a nation more than yourself, is never coming back?" Kate moved closer, her hand finding his arm. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel the tension that had taken residence in his muscles, the physical manifestation of grief that no amount of royal protocol could ease. "We tell them the truth, in words they can understand. That great-granny is watching over them from heaven, and that she would want them to remember her stories and her hugs, not her absence." The weight of responsibility had always been present in William's life, a constant companion that he had learned to carry with grace under his grandmother's guidance. But now, with King Charles facing his own health battles and the line of succession feeling more immediate than ever, that weight had multiplied tenfold. Every decision, every public appearance, every word he spoke carried the echo of a future crown that seemed to glimmer ominously in the distance. "She had so much more to teach me," William said, moving to the desk where a stack of unopened correspondence waited. Letters of condolence from world leaders, invitations to memorial services, and briefings about the upcoming funeral arrangements that would require his participation in ceremonies he had only observed from a distance before. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we'll never have, all the advice she'll never give me about raising the children, about being a king someday." Kate watched her husband struggle with emotions that royal training had never quite prepared him to handle. The public would see him at the funeral, stoic and dignified, fulfilling his role as the future king. But here, in the privacy of their home, she witnessed the boy who had lost the most important woman in his life after his mother, the man who suddenly felt unmoored from the certainties that had always guided him. The children had been shielded from the worst of it, but they sensed the change in their parents' demeanor. George, now old enough to understand death, but too young to grasp its permanence, kept asking when great-granny would visit again. Charlotte had taken to drawing pictures of castles surrounded by rainbows, as if trying to brighten the darkness that had settled over their family. Little Louis continued his playful antics, blissfully unaware that the world had shifted beneath their feet. "The funeral preparations are overwhelming the staff," Kate said, picking up one of the formal documents from the desk. "They need decisions about the procession route, about which family members will participate in which ceremonies, about 1,000 details that feel impossible to focus on right now." William nodded, understanding that the machinery of state continued to turn even when personal grief threatened to stop time entirely. The Queen's death had triggered protocols that had been planned for decades, ceremonies that would be watched by billions around the world, all requiring his participation at a moment when he could barely process his own loss. "Sometimes I catch myself reaching for the phone to call her," he admitted, sinking into the leather chair behind the desk. "Yesterday, I found myself driving toward Windsor, forgetting for a moment that she wouldn't be there to greet me with that smile and ask about the children's latest adventures." The conversations with his grandmother had been William's compass through every major decision in his adult life. When he had doubted his readiness for marriage, she had reminded him that love was worth the risk. When he had struggled with the balance between duty and family, she had shared stories of her own challenges in raising children under the scrutiny of the crown. When he had questioned his ability to serve as king someday, she had looked at him with eyes full of confidence and told him that the crown chose its wearers for reasons that might not always be clear in the moment. "She believed in you completely," Kate said, moving around the desk to stand beside his chair. "Every time she spoke about you, her face would light up with pride. She knew you would face this day someday, and she spent years preparing you for it, even when you didn't realize that's what she was doing." The memories came in waves now, triggered by the smallest things. The scent of Earl Grey tea reminded him of afternoon conversations in her sitting room. The sight of corgis in the palace gardens brought back images of her walking the grounds with her beloved dogs trotting beside her. The formal portraits hanging in the hallways seemed to watch him with her knowing eyes, as if she were still present, still guiding him through this impossible transition. "I keep wondering if she knew," William said, his hand finding Kate's. "If she sensed that her time was running short, and that's why she spent so much effort in those last months talking to me about the responsibilities that would someday be mine. She seemed more focused on legacy lately, more insistent that I understand not just the duties of the crown, but the heart behind it." The phone rang, interrupting their moment of quiet reflection. It was another call about funeral arrangements, another decision that needed to be made, another reminder that grief was a luxury that royalty could only afford in private moments like these. Kate watched William straighten his shoulders and adopt the composed tone that the public had come to expect from him, even as she could see the boy inside who just wanted to mourn his grandmother without the weight of the world watching. When he hung up the phone, the silence returned, heavy with unspoken fears about the future. The Queen had been the steady presence that held the family together through scandals and celebrations, through personal tragedies and public triumphs. Her death had left a void that felt impossible to fill, and William found himself wondering if he would ever feel ready for the responsibilities that were slowly but inevitably moving toward him. "The children want to release balloons for Great-Granny," Kate said, trying to inject a note of lightness into the heavy atmosphere. "Charlotte's idea. She thinks if they float high enough, Great-Granny will be able to see them from heaven." For the first time in weeks, William smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his grief-stricken features. She would have loved that. She always said the children's joy was the best medicine for any sadness. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace, but inside Kensington Palace, time seemed suspended between the past they had lost and the future they weren't ready to face. The Queen's death had marked the end of an era, and William found himself standing at the threshold of responsibilities he had always known would be his, but had hoped would remain distant for many more years. The evening shadows were growing longer, and soon it would be time to put on brave faces for dinner with the children, to answer their questions with wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed, to be the steady presence they needed while his own world felt like it was spinning out of control. But, for now, in the quiet sanctuary of his study, William allowed himself to grieve not just the loss of his grandmother, but the end of the life he had known and the uncertain beginning of the one that awaited him. The week leading up to the funeral had passed in a blur of formal meetings, protocol briefings, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. William moved through each obligation like a man sleepwalking through someone else's life, his body present, but his spirit still reeling from the magnitude of his loss. The palace staff, well-versed in the machinery of royal grief, had managed every detail with precision, but they could do nothing to ease the ache that had settled permanently in his chest. Kate had become his anchor in those turbulent days, reading his moods with the intuition that comes from years of loving someone deeply. She knew when to offer comfort and when to give him space to process alone. She knew which meetings required her presence as moral support and which duties he needed to face as the solitary heir to a legacy that felt heavier with each passing day. The funeral itself had been a masterpiece of ceremonial tradition, watched by billions around the world who witnessed William walking behind his grandmother's coffin with the same dignified composure his father had shown when Princess Diana died. But those watching could not see the internal storm that raged beneath his composed exterior, the battle between public duty and private anguish that threatened to overwhelm him with every step. Now, 3 days after the funeral, the palace had fallen into an eerie quiet. The visiting dignitaries had departed, the ceremonial guards had returned to their regular duties, and the intense media attention had shifted to analyzing what the Queen's death meant for the future of the monarchy. But inside their private apartments, William and Kate were left to navigate the aftermath of grief while caring for three young children who were struggling to understand why their parents seemed so sad all the time. "I found her journal," William said suddenly, looking up from the leather-bound book in his hands. He sat in the same chair where he had spent countless hours over the past weeks, surrounded by the memorabilia of a life interrupted by loss. The staff discovered it when they were organizing her personal effects at Windsor. She had been writing in it almost until the end. Kate set down the children's artwork she had been organizing and moved closer. The journal was elegant, but worn, its pages filled with the careful handwriting that had signed countless official documents throughout 7 decades of service. "Have you read it?" "Some of it," William admitted, his fingers tracing the embossed crown on the cover. "She wrote about us, about the children, about her hopes for the future of the monarchy. But there are also entries about her own fears, her own moments of doubt. I never realized how much she struggled sometimes with the weight of the crown." The revelation that even the Queen had harbored doubts felt both comforting and terrifying to William. For years, she had seemed unshakable, a pillar of strength who approached every challenge with unwavering confidence. To discover that she too had moments of uncertainty somehow made her more human. But it also meant that the doubts he harbored about his own readiness might never fully disappear. "What does she say about you?" Kate asked gently, settling into the chair beside him. William turned several pages until he found the passage that had brought him to tears when he first read it. "She wrote this just a month before she passed. William carries himself with a grace that reminds me of his grandfather. But his heart is entirely his own. He worries too much about being worthy of the crown, not understanding that worthiness isn't inherited or learned. It's forged through the courage to serve others above yourself. He already possesses everything he needs to be a great king. He just needs to trust himself the way I have always trusted him." The words hung in the air between them, a final gift from a woman who had spent decades preparing her grandson for a role that no amount of preparation could ever make easy. Kate felt tears prick at her eyes, not just for the grandmother they had lost, but for the man beside her who was struggling to see himself through the loving eyes that had watched him grow from a grieving boy into a devoted father and future king. "She was right, you know," Kate said softly, "about all of it. The children adore you, the public respects you, and you've never made a decision without considering how it would affect the people you serve. She saw what the rest of us see when we look at you." But William's struggles weren't just about his readiness for future responsibilities. The grief had awakened memories of other losses, other moments when the weight of royal duty had demanded strength he wasn't sure he possessed. Losing his grandmother brought back the pain of losing his mother, the bewilderment of navigating life without the guidance of the women who had shaped his character and values. "I keep thinking about what Mother would have said about all this," he confided, closing the journal carefully. "She never got to meet our children, never got to see me become the man I am today. And now Granny is gone too. And I feel like I'm losing the voices that always knew exactly what to say when I felt lost." The children had been William's greatest source of joy and his deepest worry throughout this difficult time. George, at 10 years old, was beginning to understand the significance of his position in the line of succession, asking questions about what it meant to be a future king that William struggled to answer with the confidence his grandmother had always shown. Charlotte, with her artistic soul and empathetic heart, had been creating elaborate drawings of family trees that included figures floating in clouds, her way of processing the reality of death and continuity. "George asked me yesterday if he'll have to live in Buckingham Palace someday," Kate said, understanding the direction of William's thoughts. "I told him that's a decision for much later, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He's too young to understand that duty can be a gift, not just a burden." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet running down the hallway, followed by Charlotte's voice calling for her parents. She burst into the study with Louis toddling behind her, both children still in their pajamas despite the late morning hour. Normal routines had been abandoned during the weeks of grief, replaced by a gentler schedule that allowed for extra hugs and impromptu family snuggling sessions. "Papa, we made something for Great Granny," Charlotte announced, holding up a colorful drawing that featured a woman in a crown surrounded by dogs and children. "Mama said we could put it somewhere special so she can see it." William lifted Charlotte onto his lap, studying the drawing with the solemnity that such offerings deserved. "This is beautiful, darling. Tell me about all the people in your picture. That's great-granny in the middle, and those are her dogs, and these are all of us having a tea party in heaven," Charlotte explained with the matter-of-fact tone that children use to describe the impossible. Louis helped with the colors, and George drew the castle in the background. Louis climbed onto Kate's lap, babbling about the picture in his toddler language that only they could fully understand. His innocence was perhaps the greatest blessing during this difficult time, his unshakable joy a reminder that life continued to offer moments of wonder even in the midst of sorrow. "Where should we put it?" William asked, glancing around the study that had become a repository of memories and mementos from his grandmother's life. "On your desk," Charlotte decided firmly. "So when you're working, you can look at it and remember that great-granny is still with us, just in a different way." The simple wisdom of a 7-year-old child cut through weeks of complex grief and philosophical struggle. William found himself smiling genuinely for the first time since the funeral, not the polite expression he wore for public appearances, but the real joy that his children could still inspire even in his darkest moments. Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed with extra stories and extended goodnight rituals, William and Kate sat together in their bedroom, the journal open between them on the coverlet. They had decided to read through it together, processing his grandmother's final thoughts and observations as a team rather than allowing the weight of her words to rest solely on William's shoulders. "She writes about the day you proposed," Kate said, pointing to an entry dated several years earlier. "Listen to this. William called today to tell me about his engagement to Catherine. I have never heard such joy in his voice, such certainty about a decision. She will be exactly what he needs, and, more importantly, exactly what the monarchy needs. A woman who chooses love over convenience, duty over comfort, and family above all else." The words brought fresh tears to Kate's eyes, remembering the nervous excitement of those early days when their relationship had been thrust into the public eye and scrutinized by a world eager to predict their success or failure. The Queen's early acceptance and support had been a lifeline during the most challenging aspects of adapting to royal life. "She believed in us before we even believed in ourselves," William said, his hand finding Kate's. "When I was terrified about bringing you into this life, about what the pressures might do to our relationship, she reminded me that the strongest marriages are forged by facing challenges together, not by avoiding them." The journal contained insights about all aspects of royal life, from the loneliness of leadership to the joy found in moments of genuine connection with the public. But, perhaps most importantly, it revealed a woman who had spent decades thinking about how to prepare the next generation for responsibilities that would outlast her own lifetime. "She has a whole section about the children," Kate discovered, flipping through several pages. Observations about their personalities, thoughts about their education, even suggestions about how to help them understand their heritage without being overwhelmed by it. As they read together, William began to understand that his grandmother's death wasn't just an ending, but also a beginning. She had spent her final years laying foundations for a future she wouldn't see, planting seeds of wisdom that would continue to grow long after her voice had been silenced. Her legacy wasn't just in the institutions she had served, but in the family she had nurtured and the values she had instilled in those who would carry on her work. "I think I'm starting to understand what she meant about trusting myself," William said as they closed the journal for the night. "She wasn't asking me to be perfect or to have all the answers immediately. She was asking me to have faith in the preparation she had given me and the love that surrounds me." The grief would continue, they both knew. There would be mornings when the absence felt fresh and sharp, moments when they would reach for guidance that was no longer available in the familiar form they had known. But there would also be the gradual recognition that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that can be carried forward, shared, and built upon by those left behind. 2 months had passed since the funeral, and the palace had slowly begun to find its new rhythm. The acute phase of grief had given way to something deeper and more complex, a process of learning to carry loss while still moving forward with the business of living. William had returned to his official duties, but there was a new quality to his public appearances, a gravitas that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than inherited privilege. Kate had watched her husband transform during these weeks, not into someone different, but into a fuller version of who he had always been meant to become. The boy who had lost his mother too young had grown into a man who understood that love persists beyond loss, and That responsibility could be a gift rather than a burden when approached with the right spirit. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the breakfast room where the family had gathered for their daily meal, a ritual that had become even more important since the Queen's death. Charlotte was chattering excitedly about her upcoming school play, while George worked methodically through his porridge, occasionally offering serious observations about world events he had overheard from the news. Louis banged his spoon against his high chair, creating a percussion soundtrack to the family conversation. The Prime Minister called this morning, William said to Kate over George's head. They want to discuss the timing of the coronation preparation meetings. Nothing urgent, but the planning process needs to begin soon. Kate nodded, understanding the subtext. King Charles's health concerns, while not immediately life-threatening, had accelerated conversations about succession that might have otherwise remained theoretical for many more years. William was being drawn gradually, but inevitably toward the responsibilities he had always known would someday be his. But the timeline had shifted in ways that made everything feel more immediate and real. Are you ready for that? Kate asked quietly, mindful of young ears that absorbed more than they seemed to notice. I don't know if anyone is ever ready, William replied, echoing words his grandmother had once shared with him during one of their private conversations. But I'm beginning to understand that readiness isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to learn them as you go, surrounded by people who believe in you. The children finished breakfast and scattered to their various activities, leaving William and Kate alone with their tea and the morning newspapers that still featured regular stories about the royal family's adjustment to life after the Queen. The coverage had been generally respectful, but the constant scrutiny served as a reminder that their grief was not entirely private, that even their healing process was of interest to a world eager to understand how the monarchy would evolve. I've been thinking about the foundation, Kate said, referring to the charitable organization they had been discussing before the Queen's death. Maybe this is the right time to move forward with it, to create something that honors her memory while addressing the issues we care about most. William set down his newspaper, intrigued by the suggestion. What were you thinking? Mental health support for families dealing with loss, especially children who lose parents or grandparents, Kate explained, her voice growing more animated as she outlined the idea. We could partner with existing organizations, fund research into grief counseling, maybe even create programs that bring families together who are going through similar experiences. The idea resonated deeply with William, who had experienced firsthand how isolating grief could be, especially when it had to be processed under public scrutiny. The thought of creating something positive from their pain, something that could help other families navigate similar challenges, felt like a way to honor his grandmother's legacy while addressing real needs in the world. She would have loved that, Williams said, already imagining how such a foundation might operate. She always said that the best way to process personal pain was to find ways to ease it for others. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William's private secretary, carrying a leather portfolio that indicated official business requiring immediate attention. These interruptions had become more frequent in recent weeks, as William's role in royal affairs expanded to fill some of the void left by his grandmother's absence. Sir, there's been a development regarding the Commonwealth tour that was postponed, the secretary said respectfully. Several of the member nations have requested that the visits be rescheduled as soon as possible. They feel it's important to maintain continuity during this period of transition. William exchanged a glance with Kate, both understanding the significance of the request. The Commonwealth had been one of the Queen's greatest passions, and maintaining those relationships would be crucial for the monarchy's future. But the thought of extensive travel, of being away from home during a time when the children still needed extra stability, felt overwhelming. What's the proposed timeline? Kate asked, already mentally calculating how they might manage such a commitment. 6 weeks, starting in the spring, the secretary replied. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada have specifically requested visits, given their special relationship with the Crown. After the secretary departed, William and Kate sat in contemplative silence, processing the weight of decisions that seemed to multiply daily. The tour represented more than diplomatic obligation. It was a test of William's readiness to step into the role his grandmother had filled with such distinction for 7 decades. We could take the children, Kate suggested tentatively. Make it a family tour, show them the Commonwealth connections their great-grandmother valued so deeply. The idea had merit, but William worried about subjecting George, Charlotte, and Louis to the intense scrutiny that would accompany such a high-profile trip. His own childhood memories of royal tours were mixed, moments of wonder at seeing new places balanced against the exhaustion of constant public performance, and the loneliness of being away from familiar surroundings. That afternoon, William found himself in the palace garden where his grandmother had spent so many peaceful hours. The head gardener had maintained her favorite rose bed exactly as she had liked it, and William often came here when he needed to think through difficult decisions. Today, he carried his grandmother's journal, reading entries that might offer guidance about balancing duty with family life. Kate found him there an hour later, sitting on the bench where the queen had loved to feed the birds in the early morning hours. Without speaking, she settled beside him, understanding that sometimes the best support was simply presence rather than advice or conversation. I found an entry about the tour father took us on when I was George's age, William said eventually, pointing to a page in the journal. She wrote about watching me struggle with the attention, how I seemed to fold in on myself when faced with crowds of strangers. She was worried that royal life might be too much for a sensitive child. But you found your way through it, Kate observed. You learned to balance the public role with the private person. Maybe the children need to see that it's possible to serve something larger than yourself without losing who you are. William continued reading, finding his grandmother's reflections on the delicate balance between preparing future generations for their responsibilities while allowing them to experience normal childhood joys. She had worried about him constantly, but she had also recognized that some lessons could only be learned through experience, not instruction. She writes about the moment she knew I would be okay, William said, his voice growing thick with emotion. It was during that same tour, after a particularly difficult day when I had been overwhelmed by the schedule. She found me crying in the hotel room, and instead of trying to make me feel better, she sat with me and cried too. She said that was when she realized that having a heart that could break for others wasn't a weakness for a future king. It was the most important qualification. The sun was beginning to set as they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the roses that would bloom again in spring, continuing their cycle of renewal despite the absence of the woman who had planted them. William realized that grief, like the garden, moved through seasons. The acute pain of winter would eventually give way to the tentative hope of spring, not because the loss became less significant, but because life insisted on continuing and love insisted on finding new ways to express itself. I think we should say yes to the tour, William said finally. Not because I feel ready for it, but because she believed I was ready for everything that would come after her death. Maybe it's time to start trusting that belief. Kate smiled, recognizing the shift in her husband's thinking. The man who had been paralyzed by the weight of expectations was beginning to understand that those expectations were also expressions of faith in his capabilities. That evening, after the children had been put to bed with their usual stories and songs, William and Kate sat together in their private sitting room, planning their goodbye to the woman who had shaped their understanding of duty, love, and service. Not a final goodbye, but a transitional one. An acknowledgement that their relationship with her memory would evolve as they stepped into the roles she had prepared them to fill. I want to take something of hers on the tour, William said, holding the journal that had become his most treasured inheritance. Something that represents her wisdom and her faith in the future. The children could each choose something too, Kate suggested. A way of including her in this new adventure, of carrying her love with them wherever they go. As they talked, William began to understand that his grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the preparation she had provided for his future responsibilities, but the love she had given him that would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The crown would be heavy, the duties would be complex, and the scrutiny would be relentless, but the foundation of love she had helped build around him would make it all bearable. The palace was quiet now, settled into its evening rhythm, but William no longer felt the oppressive weight of grief that had characterized the previous months. Instead, he felt the quiet strength that comes from understanding that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into something that can guide and sustain those left behind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions, but tonight there was peace in knowing that the woman who had loved him unconditionally would continue to do so through the memories she had left behind and the family she had helped him build. The goodbye they had shared at her funeral had been public and formal, but this goodbye was private and eternal, a promise to carry her love forward into whatever future awaited them all.